Yeah. Well, when I saw that you had you down tentative, I thought maybe you hadn't got the name of Steve yet. Okay.
Good.
So we're spared?
Yeah, we're spared.
Okay.
You put that screen down, please.
Oh, sure. Even though I'm old and getting hard of hearing, I think the bell has rung. I've asked Brother Mike Duffy to open our class with prayer, then we'll get started. Brother Mike.
Heavenly Father, we're thankful once again for the opportunity to come together with fellow Christians and to study another portion of our word and worship you. We pray, Father, to be with Rick and the rest of our teachers this morning. Pray that they might have a ready recollection of the things they've studied and prepared, that they'll present them in such a way that we can grasp the message and apply it to our lives and grow to be better Christians each day of our lives. We're thankful, Father, for the many blessings of life. Pray that all that we do here this morning will be in accordance with thy will. These and all things we ask in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thanks, Brother Mike. Randy, did you get that door that goes out in the hall, please? Thanks. We're so friendly that we get to talking. We don't want to quit. Brother Jimmy is out of town today. He should be back sometime this afternoon, so we ought to see him this evening. He asked me if I would teach the class this morning in his absence. And rather than getting into Acts and covering 3 verses and ruining his next lesson, I thought we'd just jump back into Proverbs because we haven't finished that yet. And it makes a nice place for me if I'm called upon to teach a class, especially if it's at the last minute. I've got something ready to go. I try to stay a couple lessons ahead in Proverbs, so in case that happens. But we're glad you're here this morning, and we are in chapter 23 of Proverbs, and we are ready to start at verse 10, I believe. One nice thing about Proverbs, about the first half of the book, each proverb pretty much stood alone, and it generally had 2 parts, and those parts were typically in opposition. We've now got into a section where each proverb doesn't stand alone, but they're interconnected. You might have 2 that are dealing with the same topic, maybe 3. I think one instance in chapter 22, there were 4 or 5 verses that went together. And where we left off the last time, which was in September, we had just started verse 10, which goes with 11 and 12. So let me read those 3 together. And we talked a little bit about the first part of verse 10 last time, so we won't repeat what we said then. And we want to look at the last part of verse 10. But anyway, starting with verse 10, chapter 23, Proverbs says, "Remove not the old landmark, and enter not into the fields of the fatherless. For their Redeemer is mighty, he shall plead their cause with thee. Applying thine heart unto instruction, and thine ears to the words of knowledge." Okay, so we'll look at those 3 verses to start with. And if that's all we get done, that's all we'll get done. And it may take a little bit longer on these 3 verses because I'm going to give a fairly lengthy reading out of 1 Kings to go along with the last part of verse 10. Now, the last time we talked about not removing the old landmarks, and we got into quite a discussion about it. And the idea here is, and this kind of permeates Proverbs, is do the right thing. If you do the right thing, you'll benefit, society will benefit, All God's children are benefit, that type of thing. And a lot of the first part of Proverbs would say something along to that, to that effect. If you follow God's teachings, these are the benefits that you'll get from it. The last part of the verse would be, if you don't follow God's teachings, here's what's going to happen to you. Okay? And so we see this theme throughout Proverbs, even though we're in a section where we're going to be looking at more than one verse at a time. But the idea he starts with is, live your life according to God's laws and don't start messing up. And here's a place, this first part of the verse is not to remove the old landmarks. The idea here is these things were set to delineate property. And to, there's a poem, and I think it was wrote by someone who does better in English than I do. It was written, I believe, by Frost. I may be wrong, but there's a phrase in it that says, and y'all are familiar with this, good fences do what? Make good neighbors, all right? And if you read the whole poem, we misapply that statement, okay? It's actually a sarcastic comment that in order to get along, we build fences, and we shouldn't have to. So what? Somebody mows 2 strips out of your yard. Matter of fact, he can mow 4 strips out of my yard if he wants to, all right? But the idea is property boundaries are delineated for a reason and a good reason, because it shows ownership. And sad to say, we got people who will do things like pull up markers because they don't like where they are. And we talked about this back in September, and we shouldn't do these things. But then we go on in this verse, and we get another admonition about what we're not supposed to do. And that's it. And that last part of that verse says, "And enter not into the fields of the fatherless." All right. So here's the situation. We're talking about property boundaries. Okay. And so a man dies, and he leaves a young child. Sad to say, there are people who try to take advantage of that young child. Okay. And so let's suppose there's a field there that's very fertile. And when you plant it in wheat, it brings a really good crop of wheat. Well, the next door neighbor has always been envious of that. And now that the old man's out of the way and you got that young fellow there that doesn't really know what's going on, because generally when the old man takes the young fellow out to show him the boundaries of the property, he doesn't pay a whole lot of attention. All right, I don't know if any of y'all have experienced that, but if you own any, especially a large piece of property, most of the people in the family really don't know what's going on, anything about the property boundaries or anything. This past summer, we're trying to get a logger to come in and take our white oaks because the white oaks are dying. And sad to say, they're very valuable. And the main reason they're very valuable is they make whiskey barrels out of white oak. And evidently the whiskey manufacturers are panicking. They're not going to have any white oak to make their whiskey barrels, and so they're buying up everything that they can find. And so what I was trying to do is to harvest my white oaks before they died. You got a tree that's standing up worth $1,000, it falls down and rots, it's not worth anything. And so Anna was helping me. She doesn't like me to go to the farm by myself, and so she was going with me and helping me. And I've told some of you, she pushed me down the hill once and pushed me in the pond once. And I generally did better if she didn't go along with me. But we'd go to a section of the farm, and we were flagging the property line so the logger wouldn't get over, on the neighbor's property. She says, "Well, I never knew we owned this. I never knew we owned this. This is a place I've never been before on the farm." Most of the times what people do is they like to go on the trails. They don't like to beat through the brush, which is generally where the property lines are. And so you can take advantage of that youngster who didn't pay any attention to his dad when he was trying to point out the property lines and things. And so here Solomon is enjoining people against doing things like that. Don't enter into the fields of the fatherless. And he backs it up by saying their Redeemer is always close, is always nigh. And the idea is yeah, you may get away with it in this life, but you're not going to get away with it in judgment. It's what he's pointing out. And I think there's a real good example, not so much of a person entering into the fields of the fatherless, but somebody wanting a piece of property that didn't belong to him and ends up doing things he shouldn't have done. And in the case I want to cite here, his wife egged him on to do it. Matter of fact, she's the one that hatched the plan. So open your Bibles to 1 Kings chapter 21. We're going to look at the first 19 verses. And it came to pass after these things that Naboth the Jezreelite had a vineyard, which was in Jezreel, hard by the palace of Ahab, king of Samaria. And what that old Shakespearean language is meaning by hard by, it's close. It's close to the property or a palace of Ahab the king. And those of you who studied the Old Testament must know that Ahab was a very wicked king, and he had an even more wicked wife. Okay? Her name was Jezebel. We're going to run into her in a minute. Verse 2, and Ahab spake unto Naboth, saying, give me thy vineyard, that I may have it for a garden of herbs, because it is near unto my house, and I will give thee for it a better vineyard than it, or if it seem good to thee, I will give thee the worth of it in money. Okay, so Ahab actually does what he should have done. This fellow had a vineyard that was close to Ahab's palace, and he liked the view of it, and he wanted to do a herb garden there, and so he went to Naboth, and he asked if he would be willing to sell it or trade it. He was going to give him a better vineyard to replace it, or give him the worth of it in money. So there wasn't anything wrong with what Ahab did here. And as a matter of fact, in my opinion, he did what he should have done if he wanted that piece of property. Is there anything wrong with wanting a piece of property? No, nothing wrong with it. But what happens when you get envious to the point that you do something you shouldn't do? Okay? Yeah, then it becomes wrong. Okay, verse 3. And Naboth said to Ahab, the Lord forbid it me that I should give the inheritance of my fathers unto thee. So this is a piece of property or a vineyard that had been in Naboth's family for a while, a long time. He had received it through inheritance and basically didn't think it was right for him to give up his inheritance, which, again, is fine, right? Remember when we, just a week or two ago, when we were talking about Ananias and Sapphira? Okay, they sold this piece of property, kept back part of it, took the rest of it, laid it at the apostles' feet. All right, and what Peter said to them in succession, not them together, but one at a time, he said, that property was yours. And he didn't say these words exactly, but this is what he meant. It was yours to do with what you pleased. You could keep it, you could sell it. If you sold it, you could keep the money. It's yours. The sin wasn't in not giving all the money to the apostles. What the sin is implying that they sold the property and gave all the money to the apostles. If they'd sold it for $100,000 and gave $50,000, would that have been a nice gesture for the church? Sure. It would have been. Should they have been complimented at that point? Sure. Okay? But what they did was they wanted recognition, and there may have been some motivation, altruistic motivation there. Good motivation, trying to help these people that didn't have anything. But they wanted more credit than they were willing to pay for. Okay? But Peter said, while it was yours, while it remained, wasn't it yours to do with what you wanted? And after you sold it, wasn't the money yours to do with what you wanted to? But then you've conspired in your heart to lie to the Holy Spirit. That was their sin. Not selling the property or even keeping back part of the money. Okay? So, if you have a neighbor who has a piece of property and you'd like to have it for whatever reason, okay? Maybe it makes yours more valuable. Maybe it provides an access to you for something that now you've got to go way around, but if you had that piece of property, you could go straight across. You know, there's all kinds of reasons for, maybe all the big bucks live over there. That'd be reason enough, wouldn't it, Steve? To buy that piece of property. And so the right thing to do is go to your neighbor and say, you know, I've admired that piece of property for a long time. If you're willing to sell it, I'd like to buy it. And if the fellow says, no, I think I'll keep it for a while yet, it should end there, right? Okay? And that happens all the time. And so Naboth did not want to sell it. Okay, so verse 4. Ahab came into his house heavy and displeased. Okay, I don't know what's the New King James say? Something similar? Has anybody got a New King James out?
Means unhappy.
Unhappy. Yeah, I think that's probably putting it mildly. He was really unhappy. Okay, he was heavy and displeased because of the word which Naboth the Jezreelite had spoken to him, for he had said, I will not give thee the inheritance of my fathers. All right, so he was upset that he didn't get the property. And then the last part of that verse, and he laid him down upon his bed, turned away his face, and would eat no bread. What would we call that? He was pouting, wasn't he? He was pouting. Have we ever pouted? Probably. Did our kids ever pout? Yeah, sure. Steve's holding his head really still.
The ESV translates that sullen.
Sullen.
Yeah, he's sulking.
Sulking. Yeah, he's pouting, he's sulking, he's very sullen. Okay? So he's not, I think the easiest thing to say, he's not happy. He's not happy. Okay? But up to this point, and you know, again, is that a natural reaction? Yeah, you're disappointed. You know, you had in your mind what you were going to do with that piece of property, and now all that's been dashed, okay, or crushed. You're not happy. Okay, now pouting and being sullen, and, you know, you shouldn't be doing that. But it's reasonable to be disappointed. Excuse me. Jezebel comes on the scene now, verse 5. But Jezebel his wife came to him and said unto him, Why is thy spirit so sad that thou eatest no bread? You know, he's refusing to eat. Okay, verse 6. And he said unto him, Because I spake unto Naboth the Jezreelite, and said unto him, Give me thy vineyard for money, or else, if it please thee, I will give thee another vineyard for it. And he answered, I will not give thee my vineyard. And Jezebel his wife said unto him, Dost thou now govern the kingdom of Israel? Arise and eat bread, and let thine heart be merry. I will give thee the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite. Okay? So, Jezebel, no need to worry, Ahab. You get up, change your clothes, get something to eat. I'll take care of it. Okay, so we've got an enabler here, and someone who is actually more wicked than Ahab, and that's doing something. All right, verse 8. So she wrote letters in Ahab's name and sealed them with his seal. Okay, how about a lawbreaker here? Of course, she's going to get worse. But now she is forging his name to official documents, using his official seal to stamp documents. And she sent the letters unto the elders and to the nobles that were in his city dwelling with Naboth. And she wrote in the letter, saying, Proclaim a fast, and set Naboth on high among the people. All right, so they're going to declare a fast. And generally when they had a fast, and this is where our term breakfast comes from. Okay? Break, fast. So we fast during, most of us. Most of us fast during the night. And then when we get up in the morning, we're ready to eat. So we break that fast, and we just started calling it breakfast. Okay? So people who typically have fasts better break that fast at some point or they'll die of malnutrition, excuse me. And a lot of times it's like a party, okay? There are certain religions in the world today of which I will not mention by name, but they have a period of time where they fast all day long. Then after the sun goes down, then they eat. And probably like the rest of us, if we haven't eaten for a while, we're kind of happy to eat. And so they kind of enjoy breaking their fast in the evening. So she proclaims a fast, and it's going to make it about Naboth. They want to set him up before the people. He probably doesn't know why in the world they're making a fuss over him. I'm just plain old Naboth. And the rulers are making a fuss over me. So she's setting him up. That's what she's doing. Okay, and verse 10. And set 2 men, sons of Belial. We'll talk about that in a minute. Before him to bear witness against him, saying, Thou didst blaspheme God and the king. And then carry him out and stone him that he may die. Okay, so what would we call what those 2 men did? Bore false witness. Okay? They suborned perjury. That's what Jezebel did. Went out and found 2 guys who were willing to lie, generally it's for a purpose, and it's generally for money. In this case, it could be so she didn't cut their heads off. With Jezebel, she probably did stuff like that. And they lied that they heard Naboth blaspheme God. And so that's one thing you didn't do back in those days. And so they drug him out and stoned him. Problem solved. Okay? Naboth no longer owns the vineyard. And the men of his city, even the elders and the nobles who were the inhabitants in his city, did as Jezebel had sent unto them, and it was written in the letters which she had sent unto them. So sad to say, the officials of the town took part in this, because she explained it all in the letter that she sent. Now, hate to say much in their defense, but what would have happened to them had they disobeyed her? Yeah, same thing happened to Naboth, right? Head cut off, stoned. Okay. So, verse 12, they put this plan into action. They proclaimed a fast and set Naboth on high among the people. And there came in 2 men, children of Belial, and set before him. And the men of Belial witnessed against him, even against Naboth, in the presence of the people, saying, Naboth did blaspheme God and the king. Then they carried him forth out of the city and stoned him with stones that he died. Then they sent to Jezebel, saying, Naboth is stoned and is dead. And it came to pass, when Jezebel heard that Naboth was stoned and was dead, that Jezebel said to Ahab, Arise, take possession of the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite, which he refused to give thee for money, for Naboth is not alive but dead. And it came to pass, when Ahab heard that Naboth was dead, that Ahab rose up to go down to the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite to take possession of it. All right? So Jezebel came up with a plan, executed that plan. Now the vineyard belongs to Ahab. And they both are probably kind of sitting pretty thinking, well, look what we did. And now Ahab's got his vineyard. But back to the verse in Proverbs about don't go into the fields of the fatherless, because their Redeemer is always looking out for them. Now we're going to see that happen right now. And verse 17, and the word of the Lord came to Elijah the Tishbite, saying, Arise, go down to meet Ahab, king of Israel, which is in Samaria. Behold, he is in the vineyard of Naboth, whither he is gone down to possess it. And thou shalt speak unto him, saying, Thus saith the Lord, Hast thou killed and also taken possession? And thou shalt speak unto him, saying, Thus saith the Lord, In the place where dogs licked the blood of Naboth, shall dogs lick thy blood, even thine. Okay? So what's going to happen to Ahab? Going to get his, isn't he? Okay? What goes around comes around, and it's kind of ironic and probably just that where the dogs lapped up Naboth's blood after he was stoned, Ahab's blood's going to be licked up by the dogs in exactly the same place. Okay? Now, we could go on a little further. I only had these 19 verses marked out, but let's look at the next couple. And Ahab said to Elijah, hast thou found me, O mine enemy? Here's a prophet of God, and the king of God's people, and Ahab calls this prophet his enemy. And he answered, I have found thee, because thou hast sold thyself to work evil in the sight of the Lord. Behold, I will bring evil upon thee, and will take away thy prosperity, and will cut off from Ahab. Now here's one that it's hard to read, but I'll go ahead and read it. It will cut off from Ahab him that pisseth against the wall, and him that is shut up and left in Israel. And will make thine house like the house of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, and like the house of Baasha, son of Ahijah, for the provocation wherewith thou hast provoked me to anger, and made Israel to sin. And, this is a good one, and of Jezebel also spake the Lord, saying, the dog shall eat Jezebel by the wall of Jezreel. Him that dieth of Ahab in the city the dog shall eat, and him that dieth in the field shall the fowls of the air eat. But there was none like unto Ahab, which did sell himself to work wickedness in the sight of the Lord, whom Jezebel his wife stirred up. And he goes on to talk about him following idols and so on. So he was a very, very wicked king. But he did something that God was outraged over. And it follows this verse in Proverbs about God protects those who are essentially defenseless. Now, Naboth was a grown man. However, he couldn't stand against the king. You know, the king had resources. He could command people. He could get them to do what they knew was wrong because they knew that they would suffer if they didn't obey him. And God took real issue with that. And as the story goes on, Ahab is killed in battle. And he wasn't killed here. But he was in a chariot. And he was hit by, I believe, an arrow. And he bled in the chariot. And after they took his body, they wanted to clean up the chariot. And guess where they went? To the vineyard of Naboth. And washed that chariot out. And the dogs came and licked the blood up off the ground. And Jezebel, I don't remember who it was that captured her, but God told him. He had her up on top of the wall of the city. He said, throw her down. And they tossed her off the wall. And the next morning, does anybody remember who it was that did that to Jezebel? I didn't look that up. Well, anyway, he kind of had a change of heart the next day because she was the queen of Israel, and they really probably ought to treat her body with a little bit more respect. So he sent a burial party out, and if I remember correctly, all they could find was the palms of her hands and the soles of her feet. She was eaten of dogs. And so I thought this was probably a pretty good series of verses that explain this verse, the last part of this verse in Proverbs pretty well. God protects the defenseless. And again, it may not happen in this life. You know, Naboth died, right? But God avenged him. God avenged him. And hopefully then that would be a lesson to the next king of Israel not to do something like that. Now, a lot of our sociologists say that no, there is no deterrence. You know, if you hang somebody, it doesn't deter the next guy from doing something bad. But Ahab didn't do anything bad after this, did he? So, but you know, God stands by his commands. And when he tells us not to do something, And in this case, don't enter into the fields of the fatherless. Was Naboth fatherless? He inherited something, right? So yeah, when do you inherit something? After someone dies. The death of the testator, right? A will does not go into effect till after the death of the testator. We learn that in the New Testament, especially about the probating of Jesus' last will and testament. Didn't go into effect until he died. Okay? So Naboth was fatherless, but I don't think he really fit the idea that we get when it says, don't go into the fields of the fatherless. We're talking about the idea that a man dies, leaves a young son who inherits that. And you remember back in those days, it typically went to the oldest son, and then people would try to take advantage of those. Now, I don't think that was the case with Naboth.
Lord was against anyone that would steal an inheritance,
Sure.
whether he was fatherless or not.
Yeah, right.
That was a sacred, it's a commandment.
Sure. Yeah, Steve just said that God was against people that would steal inheritance from folks. He was against people who stole, period, right? Stole, lied, And the thing of it is even though Ahab acted childish about it all, he really didn't do anything wrong until he listened to his wife. Scott's grinning there in the back. There's a moral to this story. Don't listen to your spouse when they're trying to get you to do something that goes against God. Okay? It's kind of like the government. We preach and preach and preach to do what the government tells you to do, except when they go against God. Okay? All right. Yeah.
You said you was going to...
I am. Belial? Yeah, I'm going to get to Belial. I wrote it in big letters so I wouldn't just go off and leave it. Okay. Okay, so back in verse 10. It's mentioned in verse 10, and then again it's mentioned in verse 13. Okay? Jezebel goes, she sends these instructions for these leaders of this town to go find 2 men of Belial. So let me read you what I found in a commentary. It says, Belial, that term, is applied to worthless men of the lowest sort. Okay? Such as men who would induce worship of other gods. The wicked sons of Eli were considered to be the sons of Belial. Men in general who stir up contention. It's anybody who basically makes a practice of going against God. Okay, in 2 Corinthians 6:15, let's go to that passage. 2 Corinthians in the New Testament, 6:15. Okay, I'll go back to verse 14. It says, Be ye not unequally yoked together with unbelievers, for what fellowship hath righteousness with unrighteousness, and what communion hath light with darkness, and what concord hath Christ with Belial? Or what part hath he that believeth with an infidel? All right? So Belial in that passage is used to refer to Satan. All right? And if we have people who fit this general description, worthless men of lowest sort, people that would induce worship of other gods, people that stir up contention, who's their father? The devil, right? And so Belial is used as a term, a general term, to denote people who are out actively working for Satan. And here, what did they do? They gave false witness essentially in a court of law. They perjured themselves at the direction of Jezebel in order to implicate Naboth in a crime that he did not commit. He didn't blaspheme. He conducted himself as a righteous person, You know, somebody offered to buy his property. He said, "No, I think I'll keep it." Should have ended right there. Should have ended right there. And I don't really think, now maybe I'm wrong, Ahab was really wicked. And after he slept on it, he might have come up with a plan of his own. But at least at that point, before Jezebel came into the picture, he had accepted Naboth's decision, hadn't he? Went and threw himself on the bed, refused to eat, pouted, was very sullen, okay? And then Jezebel comes in and lifts his spirits by telling him, "Don't worry, I'll fix it." So Jezebel was a terrible, terrible, terrible person. She was a daughter of who? Belial, right? She was a daughter of Belial. Ahab was a son of Belial, basically meaning that they were children of the devil because of their behavior.
Would God forgive her? I mean, she wanted forgiveness.
I think so, if she had truly repented and turned her life around. Okay, I'll give you an example. Okay, this is in my opinion, and that's all it's worth, okay? In my opinion, David did something very similar as to what Ahab and Jezebel did, okay? He saw beautiful women bathing on the top of, back in those, probably still, if you look at pictures of places in the Middle East, they have a lot of flat roof houses, okay? And so a lot of times people would go up on the roof in hot weather to get a breeze, okay, instead of staying in a stifling house. Well, Bathsheba was bathing on the rooftop of her house, and David the king saw her and lusted after her, sent for her, and made love to her, okay? I mean, you just can't put it any different, all right? She was the wife of a man by the name of Uriah, and we all know that name. A lot of times we don't know a lot about Uriah. But there's a passage in the Bible that I can't tell you where it is right now, but you can look it up. They're called David's Mighty Men. There's a group of about 20 men who were called David's Mighty Men. They were with him from the beginning. They were with him when Saul was chasing him. They were fighting his battles. They were super warriors, really. I mean, when you look at some of the biblical accounts of them, you know, this one went and killed 25 Philistines by himself. I mean, that's a pretty good warrior there, okay? Uriah is listed in that group of David's mighty men. So you look at what Uriah meant to David, okay? He fought David's battles. He risked his life on behalf of David. When they found out that Bathsheba was pregnant, he sent for Uriah to bring him a report, sent a letter to Joab, his captain of his army. Send Uriah home, need to talk to him, and tell him what's going on over there with respect to the battle. So Uriah comes, reports to David, and tells him how things are going, how the troops, how's the morale, how's the battle's been going, that type of thing. And then he says, well, but I want you to take a message back to Joab for me, but before you do, go home and say hi to your wife. Okay, so here you have a soldier's been out fighting. He's been away from his wife. Y'all have got imaginations. What's David planning here? He'll go home to his wife, enjoy her comfort, and then go back to the battle. Okay? And later when this baby's born, David's out of it because that baby's Uriah's. Didn't work. Uriah said, how can I go home and enjoy the comforts of home when my comrades are out there in tents fighting your battles? I will sleep here at your door until you send me back to the army. What kind of man was Uriah? Very loyal, mighty warrior, nice guy, right? Well, David's plan didn't work. So he sends orders back to Joab and has Uriah carry those orders to Joab. Of course, they're sealed with the stamp of the king. in those orders, it says, Joab, the next big battle you have, put Uriah at the very front of it, and then when the fighting is the thickest, you pull back from him. So what do we call a warrant like that? Death warrant, right? He sent a death warrant for Uriah and had Uriah carry it. I get so mad at David when I study that incident that I could stomp my feet and pound the pulpit because of what David did. Was David forgiven?
Yeah.
Yes, he was. Yeah. Well, kind of. Except there was another king over Israel who David had to answer to. And God sent Nathan the prophet to tell David that he was in deep trouble. But the way he did it was he told him a story of a man who had one little lamb. That's all he had was one little lamb. And it was like a household pet. Slept with him at night. This man's property bordered a very rich man who had flocks and herds. And this fellow had some important people come in, and he wanted to have a feast for them. So he sent his folks down to get that little lamb that belonged to his neighbor and slaughtered it and served it to these people. And Nathan told that to David, and David got mad. He basically said, you bring me that rich guy, he's in trouble. Okay, he's going to have to restore that lamb fourfold or tenfold or something. I don't remember exactly, at least fourfold, I think. And apologize. And if he gives you any trouble, lop off his head. That wasn't said there in the Bible, but you got that idea. Remember what Nathan said to David? Thou art the man. And then David was crushed. David just didn't really see himself that he had done anything wrong. But God and Nathan convinced him that he had, and David was crushed. Some of the Psalms were written during this time, and they show David's penitent, repentant heart and begging God to forgive him. And Nathan told him, right there on the spot, God's forgiven you. God knows you'll repent, and he's forgiven you, but there will be consequences. That child that was conceived between you and Bathsheba is going to die. You're not going to build my temple. I'll leave that to your son Solomon. And David wanted desperately to build the temple for God, but he lost that chance by what he did. So the question then that started all this was, could Jezebel have been forgiven? Yes, she could have. If she had mended her ways, truly repented, and asked God for forgiveness. But she wasn't that type of person. David had that type of heart. Jezebel didn't. Jezebel's heart was as hard as an anvil. For those of you who know what an anvil is. James, speak up.
But the point with that, with the point with that, David, not only did the child die, his house was in an uproar.
Good. Good point. And that was part of the punishment too. Your enemies will be the people of your own household. His son Absalom led a revolt against David. What happens to the king if he gets deposed in a revolt? If the king gets taken down in a revolt, what happens to the king? Generally he's killed, isn't he? You don't leave him alive because he can cause you problems down the road. When the communists took over Russia, what did they do to the ruling family? Killed them all except for one girl that escaped. I believe her name was Anastasia. But she escaped. Killed the rest of them. Because you don't want them then to turn around and lead a rebellion against you. Solomon, when he became king, he had at least one of his brothers killed who had rights to the throne over him. And he also killed David's captain, Joab. And Joab was already fomenting a rebellion against Solomon. And Solomon said, we won't have that. Okay? So I didn't think we'd get very far once we got talking about Naboth, but I thought it was a real good lesson. You know, there are tremendous lessons in the Old Testament, and I think it pretty much illustrated the last part of verse 10. So next time, if you call on me to teach, we'll start with verse 11. And maybe we'll get a little further. Enjoyed your attention and your comments, and we'll get ready for our worship.